All right, welcome everybody to this webinar. I'm here with Pedro Arnt. Pedro, would you turn on your camera?
Here I am. Hello.
Good. Hello. Good morning, everybody. Welcome. Um, this is a live webinar. It's titled Reigniting the DNA to Drive the E-commerce and FinTech Revolution in LATAM. I will be speaking with Pedro Arnt, CFO of Mercado Libre. So welcome, Pedro. Welcome and nice to have you here.
Thank you. Thanks for the invitation. It's always a pleasure chatting with you, and we get to share it with others today.
Very good. So the structure of this webinar is going to be I will ask some questions from Pedro, and we will hopefully leave plenty of time for you to ask questions. There will be a Q&A session, so please, if you have questions, write them in the questions section of the webinar, and we will answer as many questions as possible. So let's start, Pedro, and again, it's a pleasure to have you here. Pedro, you are, let me start with a personal question to you. You are the CFO of Mercado Libre, one of the unicorns in Latin America. Recently, you have become the biggest or the most valuable enterprise in the region. And you are the voice and the face of Meli when reporting to the analysts on Wall Street, and you are very familiar with hard business numbers, business data, and at the same time you became interested in culture, and so that's an interesting story. Can you share a little bit what's the story about that?
Absolutely. So, to have a great story to tell to the markets, you actually need to build a great company behind that. And that's really the only thing that matters. The narrative follows execution. And I think I came initially in my career from management consultancy. I worked at BCG, and at that point in my career, I used to think that strategy really was the key to unlocking corporate success and value. And I was very imbibed in the role of strategy. When we started Mercado Libre, and without eschewing the value of strategy, I think increasingly in the digital world and when you're inventing futures and constructing futures, I became increasingly interested and focused on execution and product development. And as we grew and we scaled, and the business began to be more and more challenging, I think we learned something that to a certain extent has become common knowledge and is a bit of a Silicon Valley mantra now, which is that really culture, the way that you execute and you carry out that strategy, is what bridged those two worlds and really potentially is the single biggest secret in unlocking corporate success. When we looked at the companies we admired, the Googles, the Facebooks, the Netflixes, the LinkedIns, I think their culture was such a constituent part of their success. And so really that glue that keeps strategy and execution together as you scale, and you scale rather quickly, is strategy. It's the famous, right, is culture. It's the famous culture eats strategy for breakfast.
Right. Well, nice. Thank you for sharing that. So Pedro, if we go back a few years, when you decided to start a project around culture, can you tell us a little bit what were your pain points? What was the challenges you were facing at that time, and what decided you to start a really conscious culture program?
Yeah. So it really was when we hit the inflection point where we began to realize that The original phase of many startups is about, first of all, figuring out what makes you different, what differentiates you in not only in your business model, but in your execution. And then I think there's a natural sort of oral history and oral transmission of this, where the founding team and the initial hirings play a critical role, basically in being themselves and transmitting those values,
Right.
that purpose, that way of executing in the office, in the cooler, in these spaces that aren't that big and we aren't that many. There's a point where we began to realize that we were hiring people from outside, we were expanding geographically, and that oral transmission and that lead by example transmission of culture had probably began to reach its maximum in terms of actually being an effective way to transmit, replicate, shape, and generate culture. And so at that point, it became clear to us that we needed to make a conscious effort to preserve and shape our culture. Now, the interesting thing, and we'll get into this, I'm sure, as we continue to chat, is that the whole effort had always been unconscious for us. We didn't even know how to talk about culture. Culture meant entirely different things to who you asked. I mean, even what the culture wasn't potentially the same depending on who you asked. And so at that point, we made a very conscious decision, I think uniting questions 1 and 2. If culture was the fundamental glue that would allow us to scale and to continue to grow the business, then we needed to consciously work on it, define it, learn how to speak about it, shape it. So that's how we started. I think we realized that we needed to work on culture, and that became a pillar of how we manage the organization and how we seek to drive success in the organization.
Thank you, Pedro. And so we can get a little bit more specific to understand the kind of challenge you were facing. Could you describe to the audience a little bit how were people working at that time? What was characteristic of the culture at that time? So if you could give us a few examples to understand.
Sure. And what's interesting about the question also is that, so we thought we were embarking on working on culture to persevere the culture we had and potentially to shape it. What was fantastic about engaging in this process was that it taught us a lot more than we ever imagined we would about the ways we work, the ways we lead, how we build products for our consumers, both the good and the bad, right? And then also about ourselves as leaders. And I'm sure we'll get into that as well as the conversation evolves. But I think there were a couple of things that in our work with you guys, we identified very clearly, right? We identified a culture that, or a way of working that didn't quite differentiate the difference between the pursuit of excellence, which has become core for us today, and perfectionism. And they're different things. And I think when we were able to unlock that and then explain to people that we were not looking to achieve perfection, that was generating fear, it was generating unproductive iterative work, but we were simply in a general pursuit of excellence. One of the big issues we were beginning to have is the work in silos. So we are a very business unit driven organization. We are a very ample organization, but the power and our differentiating competitive advantage is that we are a platform. We are an ecosystem. And for that to really be brought to full force for our users, we needed to break down silos. I think human beings are naturally at times tribal. And so really driving through that ecosystemic perspective as a core cultural value was one of the transformations. How we approached our users and how we worked for their benefit and focusing on them, and what it was that we were trying to accomplish for them, which at the end was adding value to our users, is why we are here and our purpose. And then the final one is, I'm convinced that one of the successes of Meli has always been the quality of its people, the human capital. Now, the shadow to that, the more complex side of that, is when you have a lot of very intelligent, very ambitious, very bright people in a room, you tend to have a lot of people who know. And for innovation to occur, for growth to occur, for invention to occur, you need to develop people who are interested, willing, able, and hungry for learning. So the transition from knower to learner is one that's also very important for us. And by the way, by no means am I trying to say that we've accomplished all of these. I think this is an ongoing journey. But I think these are 3 or 4 clear examples of the things that we quickly identified and we were able to start working on.
Well, that's very interesting. It's like you are saying, moving from the paradigm of certainty to the paradigm of curiosity, to become more open and looking in awe at the opportunities. That's interesting. Thank you, Pedro. Now, if we move into this work, into this body that you created, called the MELI, the DNA principles. Could you talk a little bit about that? Because you seem to have created a set of principles that will guide not only the way people think and look at the world, but also the way people behave.
Yeah. And let me talk about, if you allow me to, about process and outcome, because I think they are both critical in this. And the outcome, I think, is a living, breathing, improvable set of principles. And I think we're very proud of the ones we have, but we've also began to want to massage them and come back to them, right? So our principles, just to give people a flavor of what they are, right, is we create value for our users, we endeavor taking risk, we execute with excellence, we are in continuous beta, we compete as a team with a winning mentality or to win, and we give it our all, and we have fun while doing so. And then from each one of those, because these are very aspirational, and I remember endless sparring with you, Richi, saying, this isn't tangible enough for our engineering culture, right? This is too pie in the sky. But from this, you then have these enunciations that begin to become a lot more behavioral, right? So for example, within competing as a team to win, we say we collaborate within MELI and we compete with the outside world. We construct the best teams and we trust their decisions. And as you move down this line, you really begin to have almost a guidebook of what our expectations for how our people behave and how they execute are. So that's the outcome. But what I meant to say that the outcome is perhaps the least interesting of the 2 pieces is because the outcome is mutating and it's changing, as is your culture and as are your strategic and business needs at different points in time, right? And let's never forget that the sole reason to do this is to improve strategy and improve execution. The process was very enriching. Sorry for the long answer, because the process was a combination of trying to gather from the founding team and the existing leadership what they thought that culture was. But these cultural principles were actually not written or designed by that founding team. We built a committee of people who we thought wanted to participate and had a lot to contribute. And actually the founding team, I think Richi said, you guys are not allowed to participate in a lot of the initial work because we really want to see where the pain points are, what everyone else is saying in the organization. Right. And so this was built by a team that didn't include the senior leadership. Obviously, then the senior leadership was brought in, and a joint effort, all of this was constructed, which was an incredibly enriching process. And I think in that process itself, this is my last thought, was the initial moment where the founders and the CEO and the C-level were honoring those cultural principles by saying, this is not something we are going to give you, this is something you are going to build as an organization, and then we will all share in these principles.
Thank you, Pedro. And as as you continue to evolve in these principles, and as you say, the behavioral implications of the principles, you started, as I understand, to build these behavioral standards into the ways you run your processes, into the ways you promote people, into the ways you hire people, into the ways you search for talent. Can you say a little bit about that and its importance?
Yeah, and I think this is potentially very useful for anyone listening in. I think considering this type of work, which is we are extremely pragmatic. We are an extremely engineerial culture. So for us, things have to have almost an immediate call to action or bias to action or tangible potential impact for us to be comfortable with. I think we've evolved. I've learned a lot about sometimes surrendering to things that are more aspirational and more long term. And that's been part of my growth and my learning. But so clearly, these principles for us all along, they have had very immediate linkages to specific behaviors, but not only that, to specific human capital management systems, right? So I think what we've done is we've said you need to work on the symbolic aspects, which is the principles, it's the narratives, it's the storytelling, it's the telling of experiences. But you need to embed those in the hardcore human capital management principles, because people will then see you talk the talk and walk the talk, right? But also because those are much more actionable, tangible, and I think measurable. And so absolutely, we have built all of this in how we hire, how we fire, and we say you hire for culture and you fire for culture. And if you're unwilling to do that, if you are going to hire for culture but then fire only for results, you will not have the culture you desire, and it will be short-term gain, long-term pain. We've built it in how we promote, how we compensate. And then the other interesting piece is we are now at a point, I think almost 6-7 years into this journey, where we are getting increasingly more, I think, laser focused on being able to identify where execution pain points exist. And then from these cultural principles, build roadmaps for execution that are very tied to culture. So for example, we worked a lot, I think, last year and the previous year on decision making. And so within an organization that needs to innovate and that is somewhat chaotic and decentralized, how do you combine decentralized decision making with alignment? And we structured a whole framework of how we expect leaders to make decisions. But all of that work, which is extremely process and results oriented, right? How to make a decision, what the different roles are, when you should delegate, when you should keep it yourself, when you should escalate. But all of that feeds off of those cultural principles and that general cultural framework of how we work and how we expect our people to work.
Thank you. Very nice, Pedro. I have a few more questions, and then we will open it to whatever the people have to want to ask. You are a member of the senior leadership team, and we like to say you change culture one conversation at a time. And I'm interested in understanding how you and your colleagues have, if you have changed those conversations, how has all this work changed the way you work together?
Yeah. Transformative, right? At the end of the day, an organization, and especially a knowledge-driven organization as ours, is really about how the union of different people interact effectively and efficiently to push forward the company's agenda, right? We don't have, oil wells that if you've already won the exploration rights and deployed the CapEx, you have a big part of the competitive battle won. For us, every day is about How do I unlock value for my consumers through technology and technological innovation? So everything happens within the context of human interaction, human ideas, and fostering human innovation. Literally everything, our marketing campaigns, our slogans, the products we build, the strategies we decide. And so effective communication, being able and learning how to listen, how to interact with others in a way that's conducive to innovation and good execution is absolutely everything. So that's where we needed to get to, and it's a constant process. Now, where we started, and I said this at the beginning, and I'll be very honest about it, we didn't even know how to talk about culture. And what I mean by we didn't even know how to talk about culture is when things were not working in the way we interacted, we didn't know what to do with that. I think the typical human response, or for many, is to shy away, to not talk to the person, to try to avoid him. You only make matters worse. So I think the first thing we learned is how to talk about culture. We were told, look, this is our culture. We all went through a leadership assessment where we were told, and this is how you are as a leader. This is how people perceive you. This is how you interact with others. And now let's look at that gap between where you'd like to be and where you are. And that began to give us, although it wasn't, I think, a specific outcome of this, it began to give us the lexicon, the verbiage, the ability to talk about this, both good and bad. I mean, there are many anecdotes along the way of how we I think at times, adopted certain cultural elements that were coming up. And so every conversation within different teams ended up there. And we had to say, wait a minute, people, you know, let's backtrack a little bit. But that was incredibly enriching because we began to give people the fabric through which to interact with each other more effectively and more efficiently, and to say when things bothered them, to clearly establish compromises about what my expectation is of you and what your expectation of me should be. Because at the end of the day, those are the cultural principles, right? Is what can I expect of you, both in outcomes, but in process and how we interact. And so it unlocks, Richi, and that's why I said transformative. It unlocks completely new ways of working and collaborating and interacting with each other. Unlocks both for good, but also gives you the tools to unwind some of the things that don't work as well.
Thank you, Pedro. Thank you so much. Finally, I started personal, and I would like to end the conversation in a personal note. So the question is, what did you learn about yourself in this process?
What are you still learning about yourself in the process, I think is the answer.
Right.
I think what primarily for me is it's given me the self-awareness and the reflection to think of myself almost as a sort of out-of-body experience. How am I as a leader, and how do I want to be as a leader? And I think for each one of us, when I look at my colleagues, that's a very personal trip, and it leads in different directions, which is the other thing for people, I think, thinking of cultural work. And I remember once, I will give you the personal answer. I remember going to Zappos and spending time with them and saying, but how do you keep a single culture that's so strong? And they said, you don't. There's a general framework, but then different cells and different teams will go in slightly different directions. And then when I look at my colleagues, we all have gone in different directions. I think for me, it's taught me the role of leadership from vulnerability, leadership from honesty, and again, in my case, it's been incredibly rewarding to see, because those things resonate with who I am and what my essence is. But I think what's interesting is it's allowed me to find that point between what my essence is and how I choose to be as a leader, which might not be the same for others. But for me, it's been incredibly powerful.
Thank you. And you made me remember, I was listening to an interview from Jeff Weiner, CEO of LinkedIn, And Jeff says he was voted the best leader in Silicon Valley in 2016. So the guy obviously has something. And he was talking about leadership as bringing together wisdom and compassion, like the two faces of leadership. And he said that, wisdom without compassion could be reckless, could be even brutal. But that compassion without wisdom is foolish. What do you agree with that? What are your thoughts?
Yeah. So again, you were the one who introduced me to this, but that's sort of become, I think, a seminal piece in the Valley. His short essay on that. I think that the light bulb that went off for me when I began to think about compassion and what role it plays. And I even remember the first time it came up is when we had a really difficult decision about a leader in the company who had made a mistake, and the decision was, does he need to be fired for this or not? And so the whole issue, I think you brought it up, around compassion came up. And it's that, again, I'm going to be a bit repetitive, but in knowledge-driven organizations and human capital-driven organizations, the interaction between people is the business. And it's very evident when you start to think about compassion that you will be much more effective as a leader, as a teammate, as a collaborator, if you are able to truly put yourself in the other person's shoes and see where he's coming from. And again, I go back to that notion, and this begins to get into the whole concept of conscious business, right? We have incredibly bright, incredibly young, and incredibly ambitious people. So compassion, I think, is critical for that concoction of energy to not become, I step on my colleagues, I backstab my colleagues, I think that if they don't agree with me, it's because they simply don't understand me or they don't wish well for me. And I think that's how corporations begin to become ineffective and inefficient. Compassion is what gives you that ability to actually understand that we may disagree, I may not like where you're going, maybe you even compete with me, but if I can understand where you're coming from, then my ability to work with you and to accept that is completely different. And at the end of the day, I think the most important thing of all this is that it makes work more pleasant. If I go to work feeling that the bad things that happen to me at work don't happen because everyone has ill intent towards me, but simply because sometimes we end up on different sides of an argument, then that's just a much more fulfilling and purposeful, and I think pleasant, 10, 12, I don't know, now with coronavirus, 16-hour days that we all put in.
Right. Thank you, Pedro. Really nice to hear you. All right, so I suggest we move into the Q&A section of this webinar. I already have some questions here. I want to invite everybody, if you have questions, please write them in the questions part of this webinar, and we will try to answer as many questions as possible. And Pedro, if you allow me, I will read to you the first question that came in. It says, what are the most important national cultural factors impacting MELI's corporate culture? What have you learned about assumptions, mindsets, and behaviors across the countries in which you operate?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. So look, first of all, I think those subtleties absolutely exist, okay? Mm-hmm. But the cultural work is actually interesting because to a certain degree, it level sets, right? When you clearly tell people what your expectations of them are, and that expectation set is the same for someone in Mexico, someone in Chile, someone in Brazil, someone in Argentina, then you're giving a first tool to level set. Because you're saying, okay, maybe I spent 15 years of my career in Mexican companies where this is the way things were done. So when I land in MELI, my assumption is that it'll be similar, but I am given these guiding these are the guiding principles of what we expect from you and what our culture is, you're allowing for a huge level set. And so that's very helpful, I would say, in ironing out those differences. So that's the first point. I think it's been very helpful for us. And we're very clear to people from the get-go. I think this is also a Silicon Valley quirk, and sometimes maybe we overplay it. But when you arrive, you are told, we are different. So leave everything you've learned at the door. And again, know we're learner, right? And be prepared to start from scratch. And we say very clearly, spend your first months understanding how we do things. Because if you're not flexible enough to do that, you will not be as successful here as we know you can be. You need to understand how we do things. So that's very helpful in that sense. And I think the other piece here is, yes, we are very different, an Argentine, a Mexican, a Chilean, but a lot of these practices, they really speak to certain universal, I would say, realities about human interaction and about execution and how when you put a lot of people in a room, the things that happen. And I think, and we're not even global, we're a pan-Latina, right? So for us, I think that's less of a challenge than maybe people who actually have truly global companies. These are human, global, I think, human, I don't want to say truths because that's a bad word, but challenges.
Or principles.
Or principles that I think really apply beyond those subtle national differences. So there's more in common between all of us than we normally realize, and this makes that clearer to understand. And B, it's a great tool to iron out those differences that do exist, and I do acknowledge them at the margin.
Thank you. Have another one here for you. This is a little bit thought-provoking. It says, what would you say to some of the leaders of many corporations who say culture is a soft thing and it should be managed by HR?
Yeah. I'll give you another example that is very similar, and then I'll give it a little bit more. I also hear a lot from people when you ask them, so, have you filled the positions in your team? Have you completed your latest senior hire that you needed to do? Oh, let me check with HR. They're managing the process. And we immediately say, you haven't understood anything. If you are delegating that to HR, HR is an aid. They can assist you. This is your hiring. I hope that you're on LinkedIn. I hope that you're interacting with them on a daily basis to build those 3 finalists for the panel. And the same thing goes for culture. Culture, again, is what will allow you to succeed or fail as your organization grows. So if a leader is willing to delegate that to HR, I don't know. I also think maybe I think leadership has evolved significantly. And I think if you speak to most senior leaders at most successful organizations today, the importance of human capital, the importance of culture, I think they all have it super clear. I no longer run into colleagues who I think would have that kind of a reaction. Even as a CFO, right? I'm not even a CEO. And so we tend to be even harder. It was Richi's initial question. But even at these levels, you are only as good as your weakest link in terms of human capital, I think has become something that everyone is very aware of. Now, having said that, if you will, just one final obvious thought. Working on culture, shaping culture, and getting culture to work without extreme alignment and compromise from senior leadership is absolutely futile. So I would say this is something that needs to start from the CEO down. We could never have done half of the work we did if Marcos wasn't bought in and understood the importance of this. Then you might not need the daily engagement of the CEO, who has a very ample agenda in all the matters, but he needs to be sort of brought up to speed on what's happening, and he needs to be comfortable with what's occurring. And then teams can go out and execute.
Thank you. Here's one for you as a CFO. You're very used to measuring return on investment of different decisions. How would you say you measure the ROI in culture?
Mm-hmm. Look, I don't think we've tried to quantify it as a financial metric. Now, what we have needed to do so that we continue to advance and put resources and time behind this is to actually measure mileposts and measure improvements. Okay. And typically we try to do this quantitatively. So we run what we call pulse surveys. We run surveys with all our people, either biannually or at times even 3 times a year. And a growing portion of those pulse surveys ask specific questions about the executional issues that we identify and that we start working at from a cultural perspective. So I mentioned before that how we make decisions is one of the cultural aspects we were working on. So now when we run pulse surveys, we ask teams 8 or 9 or 10 questions about decision making. And then we track what the positive progression on those decision-making axes has been. And there you can quantify tangible improvements in how you execute across all of these lines. And so you see things like, 30% of employees used to say last year that decision-making processes were slow. 40% said that they required too much escalation. 27% said that it did not have enough input. Right? And then you measure a year later and you see the improvement along those lines. So that I have not made into a financial metric. I don't think we will try to. It's probably not possible, but you can certainly, if you set out to do it, measure tangible results from all this soft work that you undertake.
Fantastic. Thank you. You spoke at the beginning, here's another question, about silos, silo thinking and people operating in silos. Could you give some examples of changes you made to break down the silos?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that maybe was our biggest ask when we started working with you guys on this. So the first one, again, and it's very simple, but it's the power of how it gets executed, how it gets narrated and woven into how the company socializes things, and then how you build it into your systems. So the first thing was to say, we do not like silos, we do not accept silos, and we will empower you through these cultural principles when you observe siloed behavior to raise your hand and say, hey, you know what? This seems like you're really not sharing this project with my guys, and my guys are equally as affected by you about this. And that's not really one of our principles. That's a conversation that happens when the people that are willing to say, hey, I'm uncomfortable with this, know that they can grab a cultural principle and use that for the conversation. It's your typical corporate conversation where, hey, you're not sharing it with me, and the answer is I don't care.
Right.
Second is you build it into your processes. So when we calibrate talent, when we promote talent, which is also always done through calibration, when we discuss people's development and career development, when we do 360s and when we give feedback, all of this appears in that calibration. And we do take it very seriously. I'm sure all organizations ask how people do on teamwork. The magic happens when and we have done this endless times, when you make a decision to not promote a high performer because he's not a team player. And then you go back and you tell him, look, your results are phenomenal. You're very strong on all these. We have decided to not offer you the promotion because we haven't been seeing the kind of collaborative work, the kind of platform work that we expect. So let's work on this. And we've done that endless times. We've also fired people who simply aren't team players.
Thank you. Thank you. Another question for you, Pedro. Do you see a lot of counterforce, or like opposing forces between short-term quick wins and culture?
I guess maybe I'm not, maybe either I don't have an answer or I'm not understanding the question, but the reflection that it provokes in me is to say, there is a tension and a trade-off, and I kind of began to allude this sometimes, between results, okay, so the what we do, and the 20, sorry about that, and the process, right? If you only focus on what people accomplished and not how they accomplished it, you might get short-term results. You will get short-term results. I also have learned over the years, and the learnings are fabulous, right? Because sometimes it's not, oh, you got a quarterly result and then 2 quarters later things blew up on you. We have literally had examples of misaligned leaders who gave us results over 6-year periods, and then in year 7 things really blew up.
Right.
But so I think that tension is there, is if you don't do things the right way, sooner or later, whatever short-term results you were having, I firmly believe will disappear. And so we talk a lot about that, which is, you know what, this is completely contrary to our culture. Hey, it's working, but you know what, we know that long-term it won't work. So let's not cave in because it's working short-term. It's not an easy decision to make, but I think the more you've consciously observed this and talk about it, the easier it becomes as an organization.
Very good. Thank you. So I have 2 more questions here. One says, what's so special about Meli's culture? What are you proud of? And what do you want the world to know about who you are and how you work? I like this one.
Yeah. I think here you guys will see that when I say we are pragmatic, you will see that I really mean how pragmatic you are. There is no better culture than another culture. Okay, probably there are some cultures that we would all aspire to and others we wouldn't, but it's an ample range. I think what's most important is that you live and breathe and demand whatever those cultural principles that you have and that are applicable to your industry and your company are, right? Yes, you can design a culture that's completely set up for failure, but I don't think anyone will do that. I think what we are the most proud of is that we don't just design it and put it up on the walls and build it into the HR systems and then go back to executing and forget all about it because we already, we did that work. Is we really are conscious about this all the time. So what I'm the most proud of, and we still have tons of work to do, and obviously we have people who are culturally disaligned. We have leaders who are culturally disaligned. By far from saying we are perfect or it's a done job. But what I'm the most proud of is that we set out on a journey to define a culture, to shape a culture, and then to live by that culture. And I'm actually very proud of the fact that I think we've done a lot of that. So when we share what our culture is, and then you go and you ask people within Meli, what is it like to work at Meli? There's a big confluence between that. And it's very different from the first work. I mean, the very first OCI on company culture, ideal and perceived by its employees, had huge gaps. Those have been narrowing over time. So that's what I'm the most proud of. And then what it is about our culture that we are proud of, I think it's those cultural principles, right? It's continuous beta. It's not being afraid to make mistakes. It's learning from mistakes. It's innovating. It's competing as a team to win. We are rabidly competitive. We pay very close attention to what our competitors are doing because it's a very competitive industry. That's a tough balance to have. People who are rabidly competitive outside have a strong tendency to be very rabidly competitive inside. And that's just human nature. I think we've gotten better and better at allowing people to channel their competitive nature outside and then really learning how to collaborate internally. we try to have fun at what we're doing, because if not, it's impossible to sustain the level of intensity we require. But again, most of those are probably common to many organizations. So I don't think that's what makes us different. I think what makes us different is that we are actually able to live and breathe and execute against that culture quite effectively, although we still have a lot to learn and a lot to improve.
Pedro, thank you so much. Thank you so much. Very clear, very inspiring. I have a last question, and then we can close. The last question is, has gender equality, diversity ever been an issue for Meli? And if so, what have you done about it?
Yeah, it is an absolute issue. Our ratios, we have good ratios in terms of overall company hiring, overall company promotability, and overall company compensation and pay. So when you look at the total company, that's not an issue. We promote fairly, we compensate fairly, and we have about a 50-50 split. Bear in mind that we also are in an industry where, if you look at women engineers, I think they are like 14% of graduating classes. Wow. Still in Latin America. When you look at our gender distribution among leadership roles, it's piss poor, and there's no way to sugarcoat it, right? We're very conscious of it. I think we owe up to that challenge, but the way we are trying to approach it is the way I think anyone tries to approach it, which is because of these three things that I said before, which is strengthen the pipeline, make a very conscious effort in all hiring processes to be very aware of gender, right? And then if you trust that you hire without gender bias and you compensate without gender bias, then you just need to be patient, because those women leaders will rise to the top. But it's definitely still an open, I think, objective for us. And again, I've been very honest. We need to get better at that.
Very good, very good. Well, Pedro, thank you so much for this conversation. It's been very educating, and thank you all for joining this webinar. We will share the recording in a few days, and hopefully you will share some of our upcoming webinars. So again, Pedro, my gratitude to you for this time together. Thank you very much, and thank you all for joining.
Yeah, thank you so much for the invitation. Always a pleasure to speak to you, and thanks everyone for the really great questions.
Thank you. Bye-bye.